Chapter 13. The Sailor's Dishonor. Within seconds, the main dock of the Prosperity was packed shoulder to shoulder with the nearly 100 members of our crew. Lark, Pinching, and Master Payun climbed the stairs to the quarterdeck. They looked as confused as I felt. Payun joined me at the quarterdeck rail, looking down on the sailors below. "Do you know what's going on, sir?" I asked him. He looked behind him to the top deck. "No, but whatever it is, it can't be good." Tall Captain Sangra strode down the top deck stairs, flanked by her first and second lieutenants, with a half-dozen junior officers following behind. She didn't glance our way as she continued down to the main deck. The crew snapped to silent attention. Even our sails stilled, as if they didn't dare to flutter against Sangra's wishes. She stood with her chin high, surveying her crew coldly. It was strange to think that she would have been the Lady Sangra if she hadn't joined the Navy, and her skin would be bone pale instead of deep golden brown. I could never imagine her dressed in the flowing silks of the royal court, with a servant holding an umbrella over her head. She looked so solid and unyielding that I wondered if she even needed battle armor. "Bring up the thief," she called. Concerned whispers passed among the crew as two of Sangra's officers stomped up the companionway. Between them, they each held the arm of a sailor who wore her hair tied high in a bun on top of her head. I recognized her as the woman who had barked at Grebe and me on my first day out of my cabin. She had seemed so tough then. She looked much younger up here in the sunlight, with her head bowed fearfully. In fact, now that the entire crew stood gathered together for the first time, I was struck by how young everyone was. Only a few of the sailors had gray hair. We had about a dozen pups, the name given to sailors younger than 16. Some of them looked even younger than me, with wide eyes and still chubby cheeks. Technically, Grebe was a pup too, though he stood as tall as the full-grown men. The two officers guided the woman to the mainmast and released her arms. She sank to her knees in front of Captain Sangra, bowing her forehead to the deck. Sangra didn't even look at her. When the captain spoke, she addressed the crew directly. "My officers have discovered a thief on board. This sailor was caught stealing tools and medical supplies from our ship's hold with the intent to sell them when we stop in port at Pattaya Island." Sangra turned her gaze down at the woman. "Do you deny this?" "No, Captain," the woman muttered miserably. "Let me be perfectly clear," said Sangra, speaking to the entire crew. "If you were under the impression that this journey would be a jolly sailing holiday around the world, you were mistaken. This is a Mangkon Navy vessel, and we sail under the orders of Her Majesty the Queen." The captain's voice grew louder and sharper with each word. "We are on a mission, which I intend to execute swiftly and without distraction. I will not tolerate any behavior that puts our mission, or our speedy return home, in jeopardy." She turned to her first lieutenant. "You have the slate?" The lieutenant nodded at the thin gray slab in his hand. A loop of cord was strung through the top of it. "The thief shall undergo the sailor's dishonor," announced Captain Sangra, "for a full day and night." The woman with the bun winced, and several of the pups drew in their breath. I looked to Payun for some hint of what this meant, but he didn't take his eyes off the scene below. "Afterward, the thief shall remain locked in the brig and be discharged at our next port," said Sangra. She nodded to her lieutenant, then turned on her heel and strode back up to the top deck. The first lieutenant held the slate in the crook of his arm and began scrawling something across the front with a stick of white chalk. The sailor bowed her head and let the lieutenant loop the cord over her neck. The slate hung over her chest. The bright white letters spelled out the word, thief. The first lieutenant turned to address the solemn crew. "The thief will now stand in silence at the mainmast until noon tomorrow. No person is to give her food, water, or comfort during that time, nor speak to or acknowledge her in any way. From this moment on, she is no longer a member of this ship's crew." And now I understood why the woman had winced. She would have to stand on her feet in the full heat of the sun for the rest of the sweltering afternoon. She would stay out all night and through the next morning with nothing to eat or drink. All that time, her shame would be on full display. There was a long moment of silence during which no one moved, and then the lieutenant barked, "Don't stand there gaping. Get back to work." As quickly as they had assembled, the crew scattered like a shoal of startled fish. I turned to Master Payun. "Is that sort of thing typical on board a ship, sir?" "On a warship, yes. Technically, the captain was in her rights, but in a situation like this, discharging the sailor would have been enough." He put his hands on the railing and looked into the distance, muttering, "Oh, Anjali, this isn't like you." "Sir, what do you mean?" "I have known Anjali Sangra since she was a little girl hiding behind the Queen's drawing table so she could listen in on cabinet meetings. Even then she was a leader, as commanding as an old admiral." He moved closer to me and lowered his voice. "But this public humiliation was a mistake. Now the crew will be afraid of her, but they won't respect her. In fact, they may even grow to hate her. They are too young to have served beside her in the longest war. They have no loyalty to her and no stomach for harsh discipline." He drummed his fingers on the wooden rail. "She should know all this. She seems distracted, and it makes me uneasy for the journey ahead." Payun sighed and turned back to me. "Did you take the readings I asked for?" "I still need one more, sir." "Come to my cabin when you're finished," he said, starting back down the stairs. "It would be nice to get some small scrap of work done before this day is over." I lingered at the rail, looking down at the sailor, who stood with her head still bowed. The crew swirled around her as they went about their work, avoiding her like a rock in a stream. Dishonor was the right word for her punishment, and she'd have to endure it for many hours longer. Just as I was about to return to my own work, I caught a flash of black fluttering below. It was Miss Rian, striding gracefully across the deck. Like everyone else, she avoided meeting eyes with the disgraced sailor. But as Rian passed the woman, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a chunk of bread. Quickly and discreetly, she handed it to the woman without breaking stride. I looked around to see if anyone else had seen what I had just witnessed, but she had acted so swiftly that no one seemed to have noticed. Rian kept walking on as confidently as a cat along a fence.